All right. Hi, everybody. This is our first asynchronous class video. So as you might recall from our live class, and if you've read through the syllabus already, as you likely know, every week we have a hour and a half-ish live class. And then in addition to that, there will also be some kind of video or a blog post or some format for you to pick up on the second piece of what we're looking at each week. So this is our first video, and stay tuned because there will be lots more as we work through our virtual semester together. Now, for this class, the first thing that we're going to do is do a recap from our live class, and this will be a common theme throughout the semester. Generally speaking, there will be a portion of recap. This helps to connect the concepts from one class to another, and it also helps to clarify things. So we'll do this in the asynchronous classes, and then there will also be a small recap from the asynchronous videos or the asynchronous blog posts in our live class as well. You're welcome to ask questions by email about anything in the asynchronous videos or blog posts. You can also ask them in the live class during the recap. And we have a frequently asked questions section on our Brightspace learning module. So in that section as well, we'll be posting some of those common questions that come in. So please don't be shy. Please reach out to myself or Cassidy or Erica with questions that you have about the course material. Once we've done that brief recap, the next thing that's on the schedule for us to do is to start talking about mass culture and mass culture theory. So we're going to be digging into the readings from Dominic Strinati in this video here. And then I'm going to spend a little bit of time at the very end of the video talking about the first journal entry assignment, which is going to be due on Tuesday, January 19th. So it'll be due the day before our live class at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, which is the time zone that the University of Ottawa is situated in. And all of the assignments, all of the timings for our class are Eastern Standard Time. So I'll remind you about that over the course of the semester, as I know some of you are in different time zones, but Eastern Standard Time is the time zone that we'll be working in. All right, okay. So let's start with a recap from our live class. So we spent a lot of time talking about key concepts and key definitions. We're going to be working together to build our popular culture vocabulary. So over the course of the semester, we'll be talking about some theoretical frameworks or some theories that exist in the field of popular culture that will help to form this vocabulary. And we'll also be looking at very specific concepts. Now, in order to understand what popular culture is, you have to break that concept up into its subcomponents. So the first component is culture. In its simplest format, it could refer to a general process of intellectual, spiritual, and aesthetic development. So think about great philosophers, great artists, great poets. Now, there's some debate about whether or not this definition should be included within the broader definition of popular culture. So it's very important in your assignments for this course to make sure that you've defined your concept. So if you're talking about popular culture, what do you mean? And there's a difference between listing things, so film, television, movies, that's a list. Those are examples of popular culture. Whereas a definition is a bit more high level and you use the examples to help explain or provide more insight into that definition. So again, one of the first definitions of culture is a general process of intellectual, spiritual, and aesthetic development. Another definition that you could use is a particular way of life, whether of a people, period, or group. So here, think about things like holidays, sports, festivals, maybe religious celebrations. Those could all form culture, depending on how you define it. A final definition that we looked at together in our live class is the works and practices of intellectual and especially aesthetic activity. So this is where we get into what we now know as like the more traditional forms of mass media, things like novels, comic books, the visual arts. And we also start talking about practices or texts like the ballet and the theater. For the purpose of our class, culture means all of these things. And again, I would encourage you in your assignments to be very clear and define what you mean by popular culture and any other concepts that you use. All right. Another key concept that we spoke about was ideology, or some people would say ideology. At its basic level, ideology is a systematic body of ideas that is articulated by a particular group of people. So we see political ideologies as an example of an ideology, where you have, conservatives and liberals and New Democrats in Canada, Republicans and Democrats in the United States, and other countries as well. Those are different groups that have a certain body of ideas that they subscribe to and articulate. So articulate means explain here. Now, ideology, as we talked about in our live class, gets kind of a bad reputation. Some scholars and practitioners refer to ideology as the way that ideas and texts and practices can distort our reality. So how ideas and how texts can be used to shape messages, that's the connection between ideology and culture, and as we'll see very soon, and as we saw in our live class, popular culture. Everyday life is another example of a concept that we looked at in our live class. In its basic form, that refers to the ordinary routines of daily existence. We also talked in our live class about how some of these definitions are kind of value or judgment based. So ordinary, for example, could be associated with boring, bland, repetitive, whereas everyday life can also be extraordinary, depending on how you define it and how you see the practices of everyday life. Everyday life can also refer to the structures and assumptions that normalize and legitimate these ordinary routines. So again, this is the connection with ideology. While ideology can be conveyed through messages, so through texts and practices like popular culture, to present a certain version of reality, ideology can be also used in our everyday life to normalize and legitimate our routines. So it can influence how we carry out the day-to-day, essentially. Hegemony is one of the other concepts that we looked at in our live class. It refers to the way in which dominant groups in a society seek to win the consent of subordinate groups. So they seek to control or influence subordinate groups by using intellectual and moral leadership. So ideology kind of functions as a form of hegemony here. Now, again, popular culture can be separated into two terms, culture, which we looked at already, and popular. So popular could mean well-liked by many people. It could also refer to inferior kinds of work. This video is going to talk about the theory of mass culture, which positions culture and different types of culture in kind of like a hierarchy. So popular culture is sometimes viewed as a low form of culture. And the example that we looked at in our class, Tiger King, is certainly criticized for being a lower form of culture. And much of reality TV is as well. It can also refer to a work or a text that deliberately sets out to win the favor of the people. So this kind of ties back into that ideology component. Popular culture caters to a certain group of people, and it reflects what they want to see. Finally, popular culture can also refer to culture that is actually made by the people for the people. So, in this sense, popular refers to populace, as in the population. And so, popular culture is viewed as a bottom up type of culture, as almost a form of resistance by subordinate groups to dominant groups. So, again, we're seeing the connection with ideology and hegemony here with this definition of popular culture. One of the key takeaways from all of these definitions is that it's not quite as straightforward as it seems. And how we define culture and popular, how we understand the connection between ideology, hegemony, everyday life, and these other two concepts will influence how we talk about popular culture, how we understand popular culture, and even what types of cultural products we decide to include in our definition of popular culture. So that's kind of where we left off in our live class. Today's video, this video that you're watching, is going to look at a criticism or critique of popular culture that views or understands popular culture with the concept of mass culture. Now, in order to properly understand this concept, and there's lots of work that's been written about this, our class focuses on Dominic Strinati's chapter that's called Mass Culture and Popular Culture. This chapter defines mass culture, it explains where it came from, and it considers mass society theory and its relationship to mass culture. And then at the end of the chapter and at the end of this video, we're going to talk about some of the criticisms of mass culture. And so perhaps before moving a little bit forward, essentially what happens here is we have, based on our live class, a definition or several definitions of popular and culture. Dominic Strinati does a lot of work unpacking or explaining one of the criticisms of popular culture. That criticism understands or defines popular culture as mass culture. So that's just one definition. And then once he explains that criticism or critique, at the very end of his chapter and at the very end of our video, there are some counter criticisms or counter arguments to this perspective. So what we're looking at here is definition, critique, counter critique. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. We can talk a little bit more about that in our live class, and I'll also share some resources for you on Brightspace about this once we get going. So Strinati starts by thinking about some of the key debates that exist in the field of popular culture studies. He talks about the first one, which is, where does popular culture come from? So this question is about who or what determines what constitutes popular culture. Does it come from below? Does it meet one of those by the people for the people definitions? If so, then it can be viewed as a form of folk culture. Does popular culture come from above? So is it top down? If so, then it is a form of mass culture. Where popular culture comes from, what its source is really important because it's linked to the ideological perspective that's put forward by that group of people, or at least that's the argument that Strinati is making. If popular culture is top down, it's going to represent the ideology or the ideas of the people at the top of the dominant group. And if popular culture comes from below, it's going to represent and include the ideas or ideology of, the regular, everyday kind of people. So that's one of the first key debates that occurs in popular culture studies, is the where does it come from, and essentially who is making it. Another question that Strinati addresses and talks about is what happens when popular culture is commercialized. So what happens when it's made and mass marketed? This is about the influence of commercialization and industrialization on popular culture. And it raises questions about what matters from a content perspective. Is it marketability and profitability? Or is it quality, artistic value, integrity, and the intellectual ideas that are being put forward in a specific popular culture product? The next question that Strinati raises and that he identifies as a key debate in popular culture studies is, what is the ideological role of popular culture? So this again is linked to where popular culture comes from, but it's also linked to the commercialization idea. Essentially, what question number 3 is asking is, does popular culture or a popular culture product get people to accept certain ideas and values, or is it a form of rebellion, kind of like a stand against oppression? And we're going to be talking about this in some of the readings that we do over the course of the semester. We're going to look at a lot of different examples or a lot of case studies to show how different pop culture texts function in different ways. So that's kind of linked to the ideological role, and we're going to come back to that. Now, for today's video, it's important to keep in mind that mass culture is just one perspective. It's one understanding of what popular culture is. It's not the only way to define it. It's not the only way to view popular culture, but we're going to look at mass culture next. So before we can talk about the concept of mass culture, we actually have to talk about mass society and mass society theory. Now, this is because mass culture, as we'll soon see, cannot exist without a mass society. So let's ask a couple of more questions to better understand this topic. What is mass society theory? We're going to come back to this actually. Where does mass society and mass society theory come from? So mass society is linked to industrialization, which refers to mechanized or mechanical production, and urbanization, the move from rural areas to the urban, which happened many, many years ago. This is viewed as problematic because when we moved into big cities and when we switched into more mechanical production, it's argued that this resulted in the destabilization and then erosion of groups, institutions, and values that previously held society together. So what we actually saw is the destruction of tight-knit communities like religion, which was instead replaced with mechanized, monotonous, alienating factory work and office jobs. People became more anonymous in big cities. And if you think about it, if you live in an apartment building, depending on the size, how many of your neighbors do you know? How many do you know by sight? How many do you know by name? If you don't live in an apartment building and you live in a house instead, do you know all of your neighbors? Do you know everybody that goes to your church group or to your school? So this is an example of how we became more anonymous. We might pass people every day, but we don't have these strong connections that previously existed in smaller, more rural, tight-knit communities. Because of this, we also saw the proliferation or kind of spreading or loosening of our moral codes. So because we don't have those connections with people as much anymore, we start to treat them differently and we start to view things differently when you're living in certain environments. And we're going to talk about the nature versus nurture stuff in a couple classes, but this is just one example of that debate. So all of this stuff, the move from rural to urban, the shift from agrarian work to more industrialized work, and people becoming kind of like anonymous, even though we're living in a big group of people, led to what they refer to as atomization. So atomization is where the links between people become distant, sporadic, and more contractual, rather than being on deeply meaningful and morally coherent relationships. So again, think about your own network. Is it large? Is it small? How many people within those networks would you characterize your relationship with as deeply meaningful? And how many would you characterize as purely contractual? Do you know the cashier that you see every single time you go to the grocery store by name, by sight? Does it matter to you which cashier you see? In small towns and in rural communities, pre-industrialization, these things would have made a difference. You would have known everybody. Everybody kind of has a role, and that's changing and has changed in industrialized society. Okay. So why does it matter? Why does it matter that atomization has occurred? Why does it matter that we don't really know our neighbors anymore? Most of mine are annoying anyway. It matters because if industrialization and urbanization have led to the decline of traditional social organizations like church, like family, like the village or the community, which used to provide our identity and values and our moral codes, where are we getting information about this stuff today? It's argued that mass culture, AKA popular culture, now fills this void. So mass culture / popular culture has become a source of information, really a place for educating ourselves about identity, behavior, and morality. And when popular culture is criticized and viewed as a form of mass culture, it's argued that what happens is culture is being debased and trivialized and being reduced to the lowest common denominator. So mass culture theorists argue that those who control mass culture products pander to mass society to control them because mass society is vulnerable to manipulation and exploitation. We're going to unpack all of this stuff. So stay tuned. Don't check out just yet. The explanations are coming. Okay. So that's where mass society comes from. Mass society is like this big, large group of anonymized and atomized people. Mass society theory is like, whoa, this is bad because our moral codes are no longer being obtained from traditional sources of information. They're now coming from this popular culture, mass culture, which isn't a very high form of culture. It's actually, mass, here it is, mass culture. So mass culture is popular culture that is mass produced by industrialized techniques and marketed for a mass profit to a mass public. Popular culture, if you understand it as mass culture, is viewed as formulaic, repetitive, standardized, superficial, and homogenous. It's highly commercialized and it's made in large numbers. Who is the audience? Essentially, it's mass society. So it's a mass of people that, with little to no thinking or reflecting, consume and just accept the messages and ideas that they're receiving through this form of culture. This is problematic, or this is of concern, because this audience group in particular is susceptible to manipulation by and through the mass media. And so the book Strinati talks about how Nazi propaganda, which was circulated by mass media, is an example of the dangers of mass culture products. MacDonald argues that mass culture is Again, standardized, formulaic, repetitive, and superficial. This means that it celebrates trivial, sentimental, and false pleasures at the expense of more serious, intellectual, and authentic values. So this comes back to this idea of ideology and what kind of messages are being put into the media and why those messages matter. What does this all mean? Again, why does it matter? Why does it matter is a question that we'll be talking about a lot. It's a really important question to ask when we're looking at popular culture products. So for example, we talked about Tiger King in our live class. Why does it matter? Does it, it's just a television show. How can it possibly be important? So think about, why does it matter, or what are the implications of this product or of this reading, of this theory when you're looking at them for this course. So why does mass culture matter? People that are worried about popular culture and view it as a form of mass culture say, look, if mass culture is all about profits, then this means that there is less room for culture that cannot make money. Is that true? Critics of this type of popular culture argue that if something isn't popular, then it won't be produced. Well, this brings us back to the definition of popular. Strinati's book was also written in 2004. So it's a little bit outdated in terms of like the internet and the impact of the internet, but you could argue that now all kinds of forms of culture are available on the internet. And perhaps this distinction, and we're going to talk about postmodernism and this distinction in a little bit, this distinction is no longer relevant. Another implication is that mass culture / popular culture lacks intellectual stimulation and challenge. So in other words, we consume it passively. We're not worried about the messages that we're getting from it. We just sit there and soak it up. That's another concern or implication of mass culture. It's also argued that mass culture provides fantasy and escapism. So it functions kind of as a way of control, or it forces us or allows us to leave behind real world problems and escape into a fantasy world that isn't really valuable. Again, we're going to talk about some of the theories around media consumption and around the consumption of popular culture, and hopefully show that that is not true. Mass culture is also criticized for encouraging and celebrating consumerism. So if you think about product placement, if you think about social media influencers, if you think about the clothes that you're currently wearing, are they inspired by celebrities? Why do you like certain brands? If you see so-and-so drinking a soda or a Starbucks latte, are you gonna go get one? Because you've been inspired by those. So popular culture as mass culture is argued to encourage mindless consumerism, essentially. And then we're going to talk about these two groups of people in just a moment, but cultural pessimists, so pessimists are like, boo, popular culture, argue that mass culture levels down or debases all culture to the lowest common denominator. So they're arguing that popular culture / mass culture is just simple. Again, thinking about Tiger King, there's no intellectual value there. It's just a reality TV show that we can watch regardless of different other factors. Let's think about this in the context of an example. So I'm going to show you a video. We'll watch this together, and then we'll talk about it a little bit. This is kind of a satirized, extreme example of mass culture. The reading that you did, that we did together for this class, isn't a conspiracy theory in the way that this video is, but it gets to a similar point.
From this command center, we control the most influential demographic of the entire population. We decide everything, from what clothes are in style to what slang is in vogue.
Feather tank tops, matching pants, kind of a Buffy meets chicken run.
Feathers are the new rhinestones.
The new word for cool, be jerkin. As in, dude, that's jerkin. Ooh, that's dirty.
This is the epicenter of all.
So we saw already the consumerist side, where they're talking about feathers being the new rhinestones. We've also seen a bit more of the ideology or behavior side, where they're coming up with new vocabulary that's going to become popular and widely used.
From this command center, we control the.
He meets chicken rub.
Feathers are the new rhinestones.
The new word for cool will be jerkin. As in, dude, that's jerkin. Ooh, that's dirty.
This is the epicenter of all trends. We turn your world into one giant TV commercial. But how, you may ask, can our operation be so effective? Sure, these kids have brains like Play-Doh, just waiting to be molded into shape, but something else must be going on, right? The Chinese guy knows what I'm talking about. To answer some of your questions, we've produced a short educational film. Lights!
Hello, I'm Eugene Levy, and yes, I'm an actor. No, I said cappuccino. I'm here to talk to you about something very important. No, it's not about me or my career. I'm here to talk about subliminal messages in rock and roll music, or as it's simply known in some cultures, rock music. You see, for years, the government has been wisely coercing teenagers to buy products they normally wouldn't want just to get their money. Fact, kids don't have bills to pay. Fact, they don't pay taxes, but they do babysit and hold minimum wage jobs that earn them wads of cash as thick as, well, my body of work. But these kids today aren't dumb. They're not going to buy just anything. That's why the government has been planting small subliminal advertising suggestions in today's rock music. The results? We can now get these kids to buy just about anything. We can have them chasing a new trend every week. And that is good for the economy. And what's good for the economy is good for the country. So God bless the United States of America, the most ass-kicking country in the world.
But how can you control the rock bands? What if they find out about the hidden messages in their music?
Ever wonder why so many rock stars die in plane crashes? Overdose on drugs? We've been doing this a long time. If they start to get too curious, our options are endless. Bankruptcy, shocking scandals, religious conversions. We've created a highly rated TV show just to explain what happens to these people.
All right, so again, that video is a exaggeration of what is being talked about in the Strinati reading that you did. Strinati is not suggesting this government conspiracy theory. However, critiques of popular culture as mass culture point to some of these ideas about how it can be used to influence our identity, our behavior, whether it's our purchasing power and use of consumerism in that way, or how we express ourselves. And that's something that we're going to be thinking about and unpacking over the course of our semester. Now, Strinati, Ibrit, links popular culture and mass culture theory to this idea of Americanization. So Americanization, again, a critique, is associated with popular culture because Hollywood is situated in the United States, and it's arguably the home of mass culture / popular culture. And so in that sense, it's associated with the United States. Because of all of this, it's argued or critiqued that mass culture / popular culture conveys a specific ideology. It conveys American values, ideas, and traditions. And if mass culture is associated with or is viewed to represent American values and ideas, and if mass culture is viewed as a threat, then so are American values and ideas. And we actually see this taking place sometimes in Canada as well. Even though we're so closely linked with the United States in many ways, we have cultural protection policies to help encourage the production and distribution of Canadian content. And that's because the idea that media is linked with ideas and behaviors and identity is so strong. Now, cultural pessimists argue that mass culture is a lower form of culture. So they see culture in decline. And they argue that our cultural standards, again, Tiger King, is in decline. What they are talking about is the idea that American culture / mass culture / popular culture is superficial and it's designed to exploit the public and drive them to more commercialized forms of expression. And we're going to talk in our class about whether that's necessarily a bad thing. Is it bad that my t-shirt has my favorite superhero on it? Is it bad that I like Adidas because this athlete is sponsored by Adidas? Actually, mine will be Under Armour because The Rock is sponsored by Under Armour. But is that in and of itself necessarily a bad thing? We're going to talk about that. Cultural pessimists say yes, it is. It's forcing us or encouraging us to consume as a form of expression when we should be using other means, other higher forms of culture. These cultural pessimists blame Americanization, American culture, pop culture, for a decline in traditional values like hard work. They replace it instead with this desire to consume. Would I rather put in hard work? Would I rather go to the shopping mall instead? Again, we can talk about that over the course of our semester. And Booker, who's quoted in Strinati, defines Americanization as a brass, standardized mass culture that's centered on the enormously increased influence of television advertising and all these forms of popular media. So in addition to the decline of traditional values, Americanization has also been linked to the breakdown of the family. That's because it's argued that the American dream and all of the fantasies that are around that become more important than our traditional sources of information. Finally, cultural pessimists link Americanization, mass culture, and by extension, popular culture with a rise in crime. This is because these forms of culture have been associated with or accused of breaking down traditional value systems, thereby resulting in a loss of morality. And now what we're seeing is a tendency to tolerate crime or sympathize with the criminal if he or she is successful or has admirable qualities. And some of you may recall the television show Dexter from a little while ago. He is a contemporary example of this. The star of the show was a serial killer, or at least the character that he portrayed as. And yet the audience is encouraged to empathize and get into the story surrounding this character. So this is the cultural pessimist view of popular culture. However, some theorists, so the counter argument to all of this critique, argue that Americanization isn't really that bad. This is the cultural optimist view. They say that culture / popular culture has immense possibilities, and they use detective novels as an example in the Strinati text to kind of illustrate this. So detective novels become a case study in this instance. They say that these novels offered hope and inspiration. So it helped working class men, blue-collared police officers, essentially, see themselves as heroes. In addition, it provided information about identity. So young working class men that were reading detective novels thought they were more realistic and more relevant to their own lives and circumstances than, say, Shakespeare, for example. The characters in these novels spoke more like they spoke and lived their life more like they lived. So again, I would flag Tiger King. Yes, most of us, if not all of us, don't live in an animal sanctuary and we don't have mullets or sing country songs, but there's something relatable in the characters who are real people, or real people, depending on how you feel about it and how you argue it, but how these people were portrayed in this show that makes them relatable. And Tiger King is perhaps a far-fetched example as far as the reality TV genre goes. Maybe something like Big Brother, or The Bachelor, or other reality television programs are more relatable. And Joe Exotic is just kind of like an extension of that, an exaggeration or a caricature. But the point is that we see something of ourselves in these characters and in these people that are on television or in detective novels. In the context of detective novels and the link to identity, this is something at the time that wasn't available in other sources of literature. So they were the only novels that were kind of more realistic, more relatable. Now, the cultural optimists also criticize the pessimist view by arguing that the masses aren't passive. What we actually do as culture consumers is pull together different icons, and by icons they mean symbols, objects, or artifacts from popular culture that they then can relate to literally an endless number of combinations. So say we're all reality TV buffs. Say we all watch Tiger King, The Bachelor, Big Brother, and Survivor. What I take away from each of those shows, as well as how I decide to rank them, which one's my favorite, which one's my least favorite, which characters do I like best, do I now go around saying, hey, y'all cool cats and kittens? I do, but not everybody does. And so the pieces that we pull individually from these texts, from these products, the combinations that we pull from, how we rank them is all different. This means, argues the cultural optimists, that we're not mindless consumers, but we're actually actively consuming and engaging with the cultural products that we're watching, listening to, or reading. The Mercules video that we watched together in our live class is another example of this active consumption of popular culture. He has taken something that he watched and engaged with it. And that's what we're doing when we pull these icons together. And this is a good point to start thinking about for this class. So think about who you are, where you came from, why you are the way you are, as explained by and through popular culture. Yes, our identity is formed from a whole bunch of different places, just like our behaviors and our ideology. But this class argues, the entire course argues, that pop culture is one of those sources of information. And this is what your poster video presentation asks you to do. And so I like to provide an example here, which is the television show Saved by the Bell that recently went through a reboot in November of last year. In case you missed it, you can find it online. But essentially, Saved by the Bell, the original versions, followed 6 teenagers and then high school students and then university students. And some of the characters changed, but generally speaking, there were 6, and there were the same 6 for the bulk of the show. These characters were the popular kids, the dorky kid, they had the jock, they had the class president, they had the cheerleader, they were all involved in politics. They had a band at some point in time. They participated in sports events. They organized activities for their school in this fictional television show. I used to watch that show 3 times a day, every single day, Monday to Friday. And I watched it for years. I have become one of those people. I'm involved in sports. I'm involved in Students' Council. I have several jobs. I don't sing, but not for a lack of trying. And so what I have learned in reflecting upon those questions, who are you? Where have you come from? Why are you the way that you are? Is that this television show was a source of information for me about identity and behavior. And you can see that 2 ways. The cultural pessimists would say, Jen, Saved by the Bell taught you that this is how you have to behave. You have to get involved in all of these different activities in order to be successful. Cultural optimists would say, Jen, what popular culture told you through Saved by the Bell is that you can do all of these things. So one views it as like top down, the other views it as more bottom up in terms of like inspiration. So think about these things in the context of the different popular culture products that you have consumed and that you continue to consume. And we're going to come back to this idea of continuity. I still watch television shows that are like that. I still enjoy movies that are like that. So there's something there as well. But just start thinking about those questions in the context of our course. All right. Cultural optimists versus cultural pessimists. So we've talked a little bit about each, but it's important to understand them kind of like side by side to get a better idea of the different perspectives that they put forward. And perhaps one of the things that you can reflect on in your journal entry this week is, are you a cultural optimist or are you a cultural pessimist? So cultural pessimists view popular culture when understood as mass culture, as homogenous with little to no variety, as a form of culture that levels down or debases all cultures. So it's marketed to or created for the lowest common denominator. Cultural pessimists also fear that if popular culture / mass culture can't make money, it won't be made. And they view pop culture as a so-called cultural rot and its audiences as a mass of mindless zombies or sheep that just consume, 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 and don't question and don't internalize and don't take the time to dissect the messages or the meanings that are in the products that they're consuming. Cultural optimists, on the other hand, say, hey, 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 pop culture actually contains a whole bunch of options available to its audiences. It does this in two ways. It contains a rich, varied set of symbols that can be assembled and reassembled by different groups in literally limitless number of combinations. Cultural optimists also say audiences consume these symbols in a meaningful way by choosing which symbols they want. So not all of the television shows that I watched growing up resonated as strongly with me as Saved by the Bell did. That's active consumption. It's also democratizing, is what cultural optimists say. They say that popular culture allows everyone to access cultural products because they're more widely accessible and available. It's not just the classics, which might not be understandable. So they're talking about availability in terms of distribution and accessibility as well in terms of not just actually having access to them, but being able to understand and work with the messages and the stories that are being told. Finally, cultural optimists say that popular culture allowed everyday working class people to see themselves as heroes, as successful, and as fulfilling their dreams. And they say, is this really such a bad thing? So those are the two big perspectives. The critique of popular culture as mass culture is the cultural pessimists, and the counter argument or the counter critique is the cultural optimists. So what are we taking away from mass culture theory now? It's argued that mass culture theory isn't actually relevant anymore, or it's not as common as it used to be. The distinction between popular culture and mass culture, or like great literature and lower forms of culture, isn't relevant anymore. It's also said that this distinction between types of cultural products is elitist and based on value judgments that are subjective and rooted in taste. So there's no empirical evidence to say that there are these hierarchies that exist when it comes to popular culture products. It also argues that popular culture and this critique of mass culture fails to recognize that mass culture and mass cultural products can be understood, interpreted, and appreciated by non-elitist groups and that criticisms of popular culture as mass culture avoid certain benefits of mass culture. So diversity, even though, we have tons of reality TV programs, there are also other types of television programs that are out there. And within the reality TV genre, you have all of these subgenres that emerge. So those are some of the questions about whether or not mass culture theory is still relevant today. And there's a lot of other ways to think about it. We just touch on a couple. So in terms of the takeaways from this recorded video, keep in mind that there's more than one perspective on mass culture. We saw cultural optimists and cultural pessimists in this video together. Okay. Question the relevance of mass culture. Is it still a valid concept? Does it matter to our understanding of popular culture today? In terms of key terms to add to our popular culture vocabulary, there's only a couple. So mass culture is one, mass society is another, and atomization is the third. Those are the big ones, but there are other components for you to be aware of. Industrialization, urbanization, those are kind of like ways to understand these three key terms. So we'll be doing a recap of this video in our live class next week. In addition, if you have any questions, please send myself, Cassidy, or Erica an email. We'd be happy to answer those. Keep your eyes on the FAQ sections. Those kinds of questions will be posted there as well, along with the answers. And in terms of things to look forward to or to be aware of for next week. So the first journal entry is due on Tuesday, January 19th at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, so Ottawa time. For our next class on Wednesday, we're going to talk more about the group assignments. There are assigned readings. You can find links to those in Brightspace. And we're actually meeting a little bit later. So we're going to meet at 8:30 p.m. EST on the 20th of January. This is because you are all invited to attend the Job Talks presentation that's taking place at 7 p.m. But our window for our class is 7 to 10. So we'll be talking a little bit later in the night, but we'll see each other online at 8:30 p.m. EST for our live class. And finally, I just wanted to talk a little bit more about Journal 1. So essentially, as we discussed in our live class, every week you're going to be asked to prepare some kind of short reflective journal entry that explains what you learned about popular culture and the themes that we looked at in each week. So the journal entry can be based on the readings for the live class, the readings for the asynchronous class. It can be based on the video for one or the other, or the blog post for the asynchronous class. And it can talk about a whole bunch of different things. You have these prompts on the slides on the screen now. Those are also in Brightspace, but it should be a little bit deeper than in this video, I learned about mass culture. So think about that, go beyond a recap of the class. To earn full marks, you need to do more than just summarize the readings and summarize the video. You're being asked to engage with the content and think about it a bit more broadly. And again, these questions are some examples that you can use to kind of get you going. In terms of the format, there are 3 submission options. So option 1 and 2 is either a short audio or video file. 2 to 3 minutes should be more than enough. You can record it and upload it directly to Brightspace. The third option is a written journal entry. It shouldn't take you longer than 10 minutes to complete. So what I would say for both of these is that quality over quantity matters. There are no minimum length requirements, but you are asked to include more than just a sentence. That will definitely not earn you full marks. Each journal entry is worth 2% of your mark. They should be open already. They should be open as soon as our live class takes place on Wednesday. If you miss 1 or 2, you can still earn full marks for all of the journal entries, but you can submit all, not 24, all 12 of them to earn 24 marks. So you can get 4 bonus marks, assuming you earn 4 marks on, or sorry, 2 marks on each of the journal entries. So I went over this in the live class. If you have any questions about it though, please send me an email. And that's it for this video. So thank you very much for tuning in, and I will see you all Wednesday night, January 20th at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.